The following is Class 8 on the Yoga Sutras, given by Hridayananda Das Goswami in fall of 2004 in San Luis Obispo. A description of the Panchatattva will be given for the first 9 minutes, and then Sutras 228 to 239 will be discussed.
Sri Krishna Chaitanya was a great figure that appeared in India in the year 1486 in West Bengal, and was a great spiritual teacher and reformer. He was really the first great spiritual teacher in India in modern, say within recorded history, that opposed the hereditary caste system and insisted that everyone, every soul, must receive the same opportunity to know God, to love God, and that any spiritual technology or spiritual knowledge could not be restricted to a particular caste or to men or to women or to this caste or that caste. And he is accepted widely by the Vaishnava community, those who follow Krishna in his various forms, Krishna, Rama, which is the main component of Hinduism, as increasingly accepted as the incarnation of Krishna for this yuga. Yuga means the age. And he taught that in this age, which is very materialistic, even back then, imagine now, and they didn't have car dealerships back then. That in this age, the yoga process, or the easiest way to achieve perfect self-realization, was by chanting or singing the names of God. I have a cousin, I told you about, who's very close with, and she just lent me her CD or DVD of the Concert for George. That concert that Eric Clapton and Ravi Shankar organized for George Harrison in November 2002 at the Royal Albert Hall in London. And it was great to see, Ringo and Paul and Eric Clapton and Ravi Shankar. They were all chanting Hare Krishna and Om and different things. And it was especially when they chanted My Sweet Lord, the crowd went wild. They were doing all George songs. It's a very interesting concert. And so that chanting that the Beatles did, and then simultaneously, and for some reason, it's my destiny. This is like Beatle month or something, because I have a good friend who's sort of a successful author. He's published some books, and he's doing a book on George Harrison's spiritual journey. And so before he publishes it, he wants me to go over it. So I'm going over it, making like critiques and say this, don't say that, and so I was just reading where George Harrison, it's not a story I already knew, but I learned some details. George Harrison, and just after Brian Epstein suddenly died, their manager, they were very close to him, actually. They were very, very close. In fact, the Beatles, at the height of their success, like in 1967, they didn't even carry money around. Like, they actually literally didn't have money on them if they needed something, because Brian took care of everything. So he passed away, and then they were really shook up by that, and so then George is getting into spirituality and everything, and so John Lennon was kind of interested, and they thought, well, maybe we'll buy a Greek island and build a utopian community. So it took them 6 months to do Sgt. Pepper, and it was like a real ordeal, Sgt. Pepper album. It was finally over, so all the Beatles took their wives, and they decided to go on this cruise, the Greek islands. They rented this boat. And so just before they left, I guess a couple of days before they left, George Harrison, who had gone to India and was talking to Ravi Shankar, bought this album, which had been made in New York City by Bhaktivedanta Swami, my own teacher. George Harrison bought this album, they played it on the boat, and then George Harrison, as George describes it, George and John stood on the prow of the boat, sailing through the Greek islands, and one day for 6 hours without stopping, they chanted Hare Krishna. For 6 hours without stopping, because George said every time he stopped chanting, the lights went out. And Bob Dylan, actually, a friend of mine once drove across the United States in a van with Bob Dylan, and they chanted Hare Krishna the whole way. So this whole thing, which is spread all over India now and other places, actually came from this Krishna Chaitanya. He actually, and he sort of democratized spiritual liberation. He said you don't have to be like a great yogi in Himalayan mountains that renounces the world. You don't have to be born a Brahmin. You can just sing God's names, whoever you are, whatever your caste or gender, you can just sing God's names and get perfection. So in that sense, almost a Christ-like figure in Indian history in the sense of making it available for everyone. The real point is just love God, love your neighbor, and so on. So he's very much that kind of figure in Indian religious history. So that's Sri Krishna Chaitanya. And then Prabhu Nityananda. Nityananda was a close associate of his. And Nityananda literally means eternal bliss. Sri Advaita, these are all names. Gadadhar, Srivas, Adi means etc. Gaura, Bhakta Vrind, and all the community of the devotees, the community of the devoted. And so this is the traditional song which is sung to them, because there are many beautiful songs in India, many of them written in Bengali, some in Sanskrit, talk about how they made no discrimination, that who was sinful, who was not sinful, who was a Brahmin or not a Brahmin, or qualified or educated. There was no distinction, that everyone was given. They said they brought this flood and everyone was drowned in this flood of love of God. So there are many songs about it like that. And also, what's another interesting thing, just a little social history very quickly, is that Chaitanya himself came from a very sort of aristocratic Brahmin family and was highly learned. He was actually one of the great young scholars of his time in India. And his followers came from sort of aristocratic, highly educated families. And so and they attracted many learned people, and yet they had this side. There's I was once speaking to the chairman of the Harvard Sanskrit department about this, and that they were sort of like intellectual giants in their time, and they left this massive body of literature, very sophisticated Sanskrit literature. And so there's this interesting combination of people who themselves came from very sort of upper class backgrounds, were highly educated, and yet just gave it to everybody. And yet they actually broke these social barriers and made this available to everyone. So it's a very interesting, and it's a very interesting chapter in the history, India's religious history, and it's still going on. As I was saying, like with the Beatles, I mean, it's something which has not stopped. It's actually continuing to spread throughout the world. Sri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Sri Advaita Gadadhar Sri Vasadi Gaura Bhakta Vrinda. Is that too hard? Is that too complicated? Maybe a simpler one. Okay, I'll break it up I'll do a simpler melody and break it into pieces. Sri Krishna Chaitanya. Just that. Sri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Prabhu Nityananda Sri Advaita Gadadhar Sri Advaita Gadadhar Sri Vasadi Gaura Bhakta Vrinda Sri Vasadi Gaura Bhakta Vrinda Sri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Prabhu Nityananda Sri Advaita Gadadhar Sri Advaita Gadadhar Sri Vasadi Gaura Bhakta Vrinda Sri Vasadi Gaura Bhakta Vrinda Sri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Prabhu Nityananda Sri Advaita Gadadhar Sri Advaita Gadadhar Sri Vasadi Gaura Bhakta Vrinda Sri Vasadi Gaura Bhakta Vrinda. You can still hear this melody, the song sung in this melody actually in all over West Bengal, and also in the Vrindavan area south of Delhi, where many of his followers assembled in Vrindavan. We are now in the second part of the Yoga Sutras, of 4 parts, and we'll start with text 28. I actually thought that I followed, what's his name, Feuerstein, in that he separates the Sanskrit words. In Sanskrit, according to certain rules, words merge into each other under certain conditions, like yoga, which ends in a short A, and anga, this verse here. So it coalesces into yoganga. And so, what's that? Yeah, but actually the spelling they do. Yeah, I guess in French. So Feuerstein actually separates them. So I thought I'd do that too, so it makes it easier to read it. So yoga, anga anushtana, which means from the practice of the yoga limbs, this ashta anga yoga. Anga means a limb. And so from the anushtana, which literally means kind of like standing faithfully in something, continuously standing in something. So by practicing the angas, the limbs of yoga, ashuddhi kshaye, upon the destruction of ashuddhi, impurity. Kshaya means destruction. So upon the destruction of impurity, which comes from practicing the limbs of yoga, jnana deeptir, there is the light of knowledge, the jnana deeptir, the lamp or the light of knowledge, which comes from aviveka, or up to the point of viveka khyate, the perception of true distinctions. You've probably heard of Vivekananda. That figure is a well-known figure in Vivekananda. So here's the word viveka, which means a distinction, a discrimination. And so sometimes there's a curious idea that making distinctions between things was invented by white males in Europe or something, and that in other parts of the world no one makes distinctions. Everyone's kind of like floats along in this warm, fuzzy, ethereal, holistic perception of everything. Meanwhile, back in the real world, intelligent people have always made distinctions, because at any moment in life, there's a million things you could do, and you got to choose one of them. You might as well choose things for the right reasons. So there are reasons and there are choices, and that means there are distinctions. And so this isn't just like the invention of dead white males. It's something people have always done. So viveka, the perception of distinctions, and of course the big distinction that Patanjali is trying to drive home through so many analogies and so many metaphors and so many arguments and sutras, is the distinction between the eternal soul and the temporary body. That we are not bodies that have souls. It's not like I have a soul, this bright little spiritual battery inside of me that keeps me ticking. Rather, I am a soul eternally, an individual personal soul, and I have a body. This is a very important distinction. And all these other distinctions, like ignorance versus knowledge. Ignorance turns out to be taking the body to be the self. Knowledge turns out to be taking the soul to be the soul, the self to be the self. Or, for example, you'll see as we go through these, that all the distinctions really are based on this fundamental distinction between the body and the self. Cleanliness and uncleanliness. If you really see yourself as a pure soul, you will not be unclean. You will be, because you'll become free of lust and greed and all these things, because you'll be absorbed in your real pure identity, and so on. So all the distinctions between knowledge and ignorance and purity and impurity, it all boils down to taking yourself rightly to be an eternal spiritual person, or chili con carne. The carne, the flesh, taking yourself to be, wanting the passionate excitement of the body as opposed to the oceanic, eternal pleasure of the soul. So, these distinctions have to be, and that's the light of knowledge. So then, having used the word anga, Patanjali says this all happens, the destruction of impurity, the light of knowledge, perceiving right distinctions. This comes from the practice, anushtana, of yoganga, the yoga limbs. So he's going to tell you what the limbs are. They are yama, niyama, asana, pranayama, pratyahara, dharana, dhyana, samadhiyo. That's the word samadhi, but just in the plural, because it's the last word of the compound, and so because it's a bunch of things, it takes the plural case. That's why it's samadhiyo. And shtav there, which has been kind of rendered almost unrecognizable by Sandhi, by these little euphonic adjustments, is just the word ashta. Ashtau, 8. the Ashtanga.
Oh, I see. Ashta.
Yeah, so that's the Ashta word.
Okay, I was wondering where the 8 was in there.
Yeah. There's the 8. Yes.
Can I ask a question? In 228, the impurity is which word up there?
Ashuddhi. Ashuddhi.
Shuddhi. And by impurities, they mean...
Yeah, by the way, Shuddhi means purity, and is in.
Sure.
Ashuddhi. The impurities would be ignorance is an impurity, not being clean, greed is an impurity, vanity.
So some of the niyamas.
Yeah, the niyamas are to contain, to restrain these impurities. Because the soul has a nature. The soul, for example, when your body is healthy, when your body is really healthy and full of vitality and energy, it has a certain nature. It has a certain nature, and it feels good to be in the body when the body is very healthy. And so disease, we become aware of disease because something doesn't feel good. Something hurts, or something is weak, or just, disease doesn't feel great. And so in the same way, the idea here is that all of our anxiety, all of our troubles are impurities. If any unhappiness we have at all, it's some kind of impurity in the soul. And so the soul has a nature. And so when the soul is healthy, we have this tremendous vitality and enthusiasm for spiritual life, and material gratification is just extremely unappealing. It's just like, ooh, why would I want to do this? It's just, for example, when you're, let's say, not when you, but let's say when a person is sick, I don't want to say when you're sick, but when a person is sick, you just feel like lying down. But when you're healthy, you don't just feel like lying down all day. But when you're sick, you do. Or when you're sick, for example, sometimes you lose your appetite. But when you're healthy, you have a healthy appetite. And so the idea is that when you're spiritually healthy, and these impurities are gone, so anything that takes us away from the soul, like for example, let's say lust, which means that I become mesmerized by someone's physical body. I mean, bodies can be beautiful, however, they're also temporary, and they're also not the real person. And so therefore, an emotion which sort of draws my consciousness deeply into matter is taking me away from spirit. So that would be considered an impurity. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
So these 8 limbs of yoga, and of course now Patanjali is going to talk about them one by one. And he starts with the yamas, which can be translated the restraints. Interestingly, as I've mentioned before, the word yama is also the name in the whole Vedic Hindu culture for the god of death, the lord of death. If someone is sinful, they go to yama. And so it's a very common way of speaking in, say, the Mahabharata or this ancient literature that someone went to the abode of yama, which means they died. And so what's interesting about yama, he's a very prominent figure in this whole culture, is that you have the same word as the first limb of yoga and also the lord of death. And the reason is because if someone cannot restrain themselves, yama will restrain you.
The ultimate restraint.
Yeah. It's just like, say, the prison system. I mean, forget all the impurities in the American prison system, but the general notion that sometimes some people are incarcerated, it's like if I can't control myself, then the government controls me. So that's why yama, with the same name, means the lord of death and also the first limb of yoga. So, the yamas are ahimsa, non-violence, non-injury, non-harming, however you want to translate it. Himsa meaning violence, harm, and injury, and meaning not. Satya, truth. Asteya, not stealing. Brahmacharya. Translated chastity here, Brahma, the word Brahma, which can mean the absolute, is also an ancient word for the Vedas. And charya means conduct. So brahmacharya literally means behaving or acting according to the Vedas, and it refers to the first stage of student life, where the young person would go to the guru's ashram and learn to follow the Vedas. moral principles, rituals, mantras, everything. But because in India, student life was always celibate, because there's no premarital sex for civilized people in that culture, therefore it comes to mean celibacy. And here, chastity, some people go with the word chastity. I kind of went with that word because really, if one sex under appropriate circumstances really doesn't violate the general principle of chastity or of this principle. So, but anyway, that's what it means. It really means a lot, celibacy. That's the word you'd use for celibacy. If you just wanted to say celibacy in an ancient Sanskrit text, you would say brahmacharya. And so chastity is sort of somewhat of a more liberal translation of it.
Is chaste does it have a bigger meaning, a more general meaning than just in the sense of sexual conduct? Being chaste, being more pure, or
yeah, I think
have to look at.
Yeah, because I think that in my mind, and seen in some ways it's been used, it has something to do with also with a type of loyalty. In other words, let's say within a relationship, if people are monogamous and they're in a relationship, then chastity has to do with being loyal to that relationship and keeping that relationship special. And so I suppose all the ways in which you honor the specialness of a relationship, at least in my mind, there's something about chastity. Aparigraha, not being possessive. Graha, as I've explained, graha is the same as our English word grab, grasp. It's a word to take. And pari is Greek peri, like perimeter, all around, like taking everything. And so parigraha comes to mean possessiveness. It comes to mean possessive. It's the aparigraha, not being possessive. It's interesting how three of these words are negatives. Aparigraha, asteya, ahimsa, not doing this. And so there's three don'ts here. So I put the restraints are non-injury, truth, not stealing, chastity, non-possessiveness. And now Patanjali makes a very interesting comment. Jati desha kala samaya anava chinna sarvabhoma mahavratam. He says this is the mahavrata, the great vow, the great oath, and it is universal. And universal is my translation of the word sarvabhoma. Sarva means all, or every, and bhoma comes from the word bhumi, which means earth or land. And so sarvabhoma means in every land, in every place, in every circumstance. So I just translated it universal. And it's not avachinna. It's not avachinna. It's unavachinna. And avachinna means like sort of divided up, divided down into sections. In other words, it's not limited. It's not limited. It's universal. It's not limited by samaya, circumstances, kala, time, desha, place, jati, birth. I did translate it. And in India, jati also means your birth community, like it became actually somewhat obsessive, I think, at some point in Indian culture. But in other words, like say you're born in a state, and then you're born in a particular community, and then a sub-community. So your jati is your birth community, like your ethnic birth community. And it gets very technical. And they're fanatical about marriages. I mean, if you marry outside this technical birth community, it's like, it's a major disaster for the family. So Patanjali is saying that, in other words, you can't say that under certain circumstances I'll be promiscuous, I will lie. Now, there is a special category that's not referring. You may say something like, well, what happens if to save the life of 100 innocent children you've got to tell a lie? Or he's really not talking about that, because that's a special case. In Sanskrit, when it's really an emergency, it's like an emergency. And like, for example, let's say your neighbor's house is on fire and there are like innocent children sleeping. Well, how could they be guilty children? Let's say there are children sleeping in the house, and so let's say you go to one of your other neighbors and he's not home and just take an axe out of his garage to break the door down to save the children. You can say, well, that's stealing. And Patanjali said that you should never steal. So people in Vedic culture were not idiots. That's the good news. And so there is a word in Sanskrit, apad, which means an emergency, like some real misfortune, a crisis, a disaster. And so they have a special category called, plan ahead. Apadharma, which means what is your duty? What is your sacred duty at a time of emergency? And that's a whole special category. So Patanjali is not canceling that out here. So if it's really an emergency, then you do what you have to do. In fact, I know in the Bhagavad Purana, like several times, there's a statement that one should do such and such or not do such and such, anapadi, if it's not an emergency. So that was recognized, obviously. I mean, under normal conditions, if you take an axe, chop down your neighbor's front door, grab his children, take them out of their beds, and take them to your house, I mean, you'll be hanged from the highest tree. If there's a fire in the house and the children are sleeping, there's no one else home, you'll be the town hero. So that's the point. So when Patanjali says these are universal rules, he's not talking about this special category of emergency. But he says, so you can understand that what Patanjali means here is anapadi, when it's not an emergency. Under normal circumstances, you could never steal, you could never be promiscuous, or lie, or be violent toward people, injure people, or be possessive. In a God-conscious civilization, to really, really believe this is mine is considered vulgar. I mean, it's considered really extremely bad taste, like real ignorance. Because of course, like nowadays there's sort of a way of talking that we are the stewards of the earth, and so on. And there's this beautiful line in I think I might have mentioned this once. One of my favorite composers is Henry Purcell. He's born in 1659, died in 1695. He's the greatest English composer of the 17th century. And he was also the composer for the King and Queen of England. Anyway, they had this ceremony called St. Cecilia's Day, because in the 17th century in Europe, they believed that St. Cecilia was the patron saint of artists, of the musicians and the composers and the poets and of the artists, the artist community. So all the artists, the poets and the composers and the artists, they would all meet once a year and have a festival in honor of St. Cecilia. And it was like a spiritual service, but also especially for artists. It's very interesting. And so in England they did this, and on two occasions they asked Purcell to write the music for the festival because he was so good. And there's one beautiful song in the second St. Cecilia Day music that he wrote, where it says that when we make music, we are repaying, out of gratitude, we are repaying to heaven the melody that heaven lent to us. So they had this consciousness. That heaven and God was lending to us certain beauty, certain melodies. And by composing and playing this music, we are simply repaying our debt to heaven. What these things, to whom these things really belong. It's a very nice consciousness.
Was that in England?
That was in England. But in general, even Bach, after everything he wrote, Bach wrote to the glory of God. And he very much had this consciousness of being a servant of God.
So is it true then that some people don't have a consciousness of God, or does everybody have a consciousness of God and they just forget? Yes,
everyone has it within them. In fact, there's one beautiful statement in Bengali coming from one of the biographies of Chaitanya, actually. A biography written in the, the 1500s, probably late 1500s. That, how does it go? Nitya Siddha Krishna Prema Sadhya Kabunai, Savanadi Shuddha Chite Karayudai. That love of God actually exists in everyone. However, Krishna, it's not something that you sort of have to create and then bring into yourself. It's like everyone's not a born musician, or say in terms of technically, but everyone is a born lover of God. And so it's that Shravanadi Shuddha, when the consciousness is purified by hearing the truth and by repeating it and by practicing spiritual life, then this love awakens. But that it actually exists in everyone. And also one of the great philosophers in Indian history, Ramanuja, who was from southeast India, the modern state of Tamil Nadu, great Vedantist. He wrote one of the 2 or 3 most important Vedanta commentaries in the history of India. His dates are about approximately 1,000 years ago. And in his Vedanta commentary, he states that our spiritual form, our swarupa, a word we had before, our eternal spiritual form already exists. The spiritual body, the spiritual form with which we associate with God, it just has to be brought back to manifestation by spiritual practice. But that our eternal form is already there. So, moving right along here, this metaphysical terrain. So he says that this is universal. Because he's going to distinguish them from the niyamas. The niyamas are not universal. Sometimes you can do them, sometimes you can't. But the yamas, he said, you have to always do them. And then now he's going to explain what the niyamas are. Shocha, santosha, tapak, swadhyaya, ishvara, paridhanani, niyama. The observances, I sort of followed other translators here. The observances are cleanliness, satisfaction, austerity, study, and devotion to the Lord. Because, anyway, those are the niyamas. Any question about that? He will discuss these in detail later. So first he's going to discuss each of the yamas in more greater detail than each of the niyamas. So there's no questions. Then he says, Vitarka badane pratipaksha bhavana. When harassed by wrong deliberations, one affects, in the sense that brings about, the opposite. He's going to explain what he means by that. In other words, if your mind is going crazy and you're just thinking bad thoughts, then you have to kind of counteract that. That's all he's really saying. You have to counteract it. And I was discussing with Jennifer one day, we were, I think, about how at a certain point, something I've often heard in yoga classes where you sort of observe your mind. And I was saying you observe it, that's like reconnaissance. You're doing reconnaissance work, and then once you figure out what it is, you have to kind of... In other words, if you only observed your mind, you would just sit there and watch your mind go over it once. This would go on all day. So you observe it to become objective about it, to get a little distance from it so you can sort of see it for what it is, and then make the right decisions about it. But ultimately, Patanjali is saying that pratipaksha bhavana, you have to bring about or affect the opposite. He's going to say more about this. He's going to explain now what the word pratipaksha bhavana means, what it means to bring about the opposite. Vitarka hingsadya. So first he says that vitarka means things like violence, hingsa, etc. So it's the opposite of the good stuff. Hey, just one little technical note. I can't resist. So forgive me my grammatical indulgences, but I find it interesting. In this word vitarka, the word tarka by itself sort of means logic or analysis and so on, reason. And the word vi is very interesting. I'll just mention this briefly. If you're interested in Sanskrit language, vi, which is actually, it seems like it must be related because it means the same thing to the Italian via. Like the way in Italy, if they want to say like out here, they say via. It's like away. And so even our English word way, like in the sense of away. And so that's what vi means. So vi means to separate. Vi means to separate, like they'll say vi-yoga, which means like dislinking or disconnecting. It has two main senses, two main meanings, which you'll find in words and which can cause confusion. One is it means sort of like something which is bad, or in the sense of like mislogic, which is the way it's being used here. In other words, logic which goes off the path. Mislogic. But also, it can mean away or separate. It can mean separating in another sense, in the sense of categorical distribution, putting everything in its place. In other words, separating in the sense of categorizing things. So it can mean away in the sense of going off, deviating, or it can mean separating in the sense of categorizing things. And so therefore the word vitarka can have a positive sense, sort of like categorical reason. sort of categorically analyzing things. So very good analysis, or it can mean mislogic in the sense of logic that deviates from the truth. And whether it is krita, done, in other words, you do it yourself, karita, you make someone else do it, anumodita, or you simply give permission. You simply allow it. Whether you do it, make someone else do it, or simply let it happen. He's covering all the bases here. Krita, karita, anumodita, and whether lobha, krodha, moha, purvaka, whether it is based on greed or anger or illusion. The word purvaka, the fascinating little prefix, got to throw this in. Purva means first in Sanskrit, or former, or first, or before. And so purvaka, the ka means, sort of stands for making. So it means whether you make as primary, in other words, whether it's based on, whether you make lobha, greed, the primary cause, whether you make krodha the primary thing. So it's used as a suffix, a suffix to mean that it's based on something, or it especially is characterized by something. So this violence and all these bad things that you're not supposed to do, they're all wrong conclusions. It's a wrong way of seeing things. Whether you do it yourself, whether you make someone else do it, whether you just allow it to happen, whether it's based on greed or anger or illusion, and whether it's mridu, madhya, adimatra, whether it's mridu, which means literally soft, in other words, mild. If it's just sort of like mild violence, like you only slightly mutilated someone. If it's mild, or if it's madhya, medium, related to our English word middle and medium, whether it's mild or medium, or adimatra, which sort of means over the top, literally. Adi means over, like just over the top, excessive. So mild, medium, or excessive. It is dukkha ajnana ananta phala, which means anta means the end, and ananta means endless. It's endless fruits. It's like the unending fruit, phala, of this bad stuff is dukkha, misery, and ajnana, ignorance. That these vitarka, these bad ways of thinking that cause us to harm people and do other bad things, he says whether you do it yourself, make someone else do it, or you simply allow it, whether it's because of greed or anger or illusion, whether it's mild or medium or over the top, it's going to endlessly produce misery and ignorance. So these people were serious about morality and stuff. I mean, you can see these people are very serious about this. Is not kind of like ethereal, it's all one stuff. These are.
But that's correct observation.
Yes.
That's very true.
Yeah, he's right.
Yeah.
But it's I'm saying these are very staunch, serious people that make distinctions. He says in the first verse we read today that by practicing the limbs of yoga, when your impurity is destroyed and you're enlightened, you make distinctions. You make distinctions. And so there's it's very admirable. I think it's great stuff. It's just
and even in its mild form, you have to be careful.
Yes, because it grows. It's like, I just have a little bit of cancer. I don't have to worry about it. Yes.
But also, isn't there a positive karma when it may seem like it's a bad thing when it's used for good?
Such as?
Like when you said about going in the house to rescue someone
for
fire. Like something that may be seemingly bad can be actually good.
If it's really, well, in that case it's an emergency, and clearly,
right.
I don't think people go to save children from a fire out of greed or anger so it's.
But something can also appear to be some way when it's really for a better purpose.
Right, but I think Patanjali is concerned with the real substance here. What's really happening? Yes.
So I'm wondering about the times when I see somebody with a speck of dust in their eye, and I want to go take it out, and I've got a plank in my own. So I'm just wondering where it sounded to me that you were implying that if you had an illusion, or maybe it wasn't an illusion, maybe you see somebody beating their kid, whatever, there's some kind of abuse going on, then it sounds to me that you're saying that it's your job then to stop that abuse. You know, you don't just sort of walk by and go, holy. You would go in and say, cut it out.
That's interesting. I sort of used an easy example. You know, your neighbor's house on fire and the poor kids are in there, and so it's a no-brainer. You have to go in there and help the kids. In terms of exactly to what extent we should be activists, to what extent we should proactively, fight for good in society, it's an interesting topic. I mean, I hadn't really thought about that, but...
I thought there was implied here with what you said about that you don't permit.
Very good point. That's a very astute observation. Then it gets to the point, at what extent are you permitting? In other words, to what...
Well, let's say somebody was being robbed and you just turned your back and walked away because you knew you'd get into trouble legally or whatever it was. It's that. That's going to cause some harm.
Yeah. My younger brother, who's now a tycoon, but when he was younger, he was driving down Wilshire Boulevard there, in Beverly Hills, and he saw literally an old lady being assaulted by some bad guy. And he stopped his car and jumped out and tackled the guy, and he got a certificate from the Beverly Hills Police, but then they said, don't do that again, you get yourself killed. So it's it's a funny world. But I mean, you raise a very interesting point. At what point are you a permitter? At what point is it not really your responsibility? That's a very serious point.
For practicing yoga, you get the ability to make those distinctions.
Yeah, it's a question which has troubled and concerned people, I think, for millennia. I mean, it's a very serious issue based on the circumstances and possibility. But you raise a very interesting point. We should think about it.
I have a memory of when I lived in San Francisco and we worked in this small store. And it was leather goods, and some guy came in and ripped us off from a pants and jacket. And I felt, that it was my job to protect. Though I didn't own the store, but still I felt like it was a part of my job to stop that. I don't know what really came over me, but I got really big and I got really strong and fast, and I ran the guy down and grabbed the stuff and took it back. And he was tall and he was a different color than me, and I just was like, wow, ferocious. But it felt like I needed to do that because otherwise I felt like then it would be like a leak in the dike, You let one little thing happen and another little thing, and pretty soon you're going to be asleep in the bed and they're going to come get you. So it just was some instinct with me, and
You have a good spirit.
Yeah, but it reminded me of like an emergency, and maybe it wasn't, because then the owner of the store said you didn't really have to do that. But part of what I felt was, it's like, you don't come on my street and do that. That's not what happens here. And all these other merchants were kind of standing out on the streets watching. I was kind of shocked that I did it too, but it was a real strong, immediate feeling, based on the idea that you don't steal.
Yeah.
Especially,
The topic you brought up is, of course, the kind of topic they discuss for days and days in philosophy classes. Because there's all kinds of angles, so it's...
So it's not really cut and dry, but you can go to your heart and just say, I didn't mean to cause harm.
No, but you have identified a very important issue, which maybe we'll discuss. Let me see if I can just get through these verses, but thank you for bringing that up.
Okay.
Ahimsa pratishtayam tatsanidho vairotyaga. Now he says, this is what happens when you do the good stuff. Because ahimsa, remember, is the first yama. So just to get this is like a little outline thing, just to get the little thing straight. By practicing the limbs of yoga, you destroy your impurities, the lights go on, you make the right distinctions, and you get spiritually saved. But there are 8 limbs of yoga. The first limb is yama. And there are different yamas. Now he's going to talk about the first one, which is ahimsa. Interesting that there's a statement in the Mahabharata, ahimsa paramo dharma, the highest dharma is ahimsa, non-violence. So it's interesting that the pride of place, the first yama is this non-violence. It's so important not to harm people. And Patanjali says, pratishta, shta means is stand, same as English, and prati, counter. So it's kind of like when something is really rooted, really has this firm foundation. That's pratishta, a foundation. So in the establishment, I think I translated this, when non-injury is established, ahimsa pratishtayam, tatsanidho vairutyaga, in that person's presence, tatsanidho, people give up their enmity. In other words, virtue is contagious, is kind of what he's saying here. Stand up. So that when you do a tree pose. So if you really are nonviolent, you really, and I think which also includes, sometimes people can like you go into a store or someplace and some person is sort of like saying, yes, can I help you? But there's almost like this simmering anger underneath the surface. Yeah, so I think ahimsa really means that at a very deep level, you really have no bad wish for the person. There's no hostility. There's nothing. It's just there's nothing. You don't wish any ill to the person at all, at any level. No envy, no hostility at any level, subtle or gross. And so Patanjali is saying, if you're like that, then in your presence, people will give up their hostility. Blessed are the peacemakers. So, then he says, Satya Pratishtayam, when truth is established, Kriya Phala Ashrayatam. I thought about this translation, and I read some of the other translations. I wasn't satisfied. I thought because they were too non-literal. And I wanted to, what does this literally mean? So, the first line, Satya Pratishtayam, when truth is established, or literally upon the establishing of truth. And then he says, Kriya, action. Kriya is action. Phala means the fruit of action. The fruit of action. Ashraya means a shelter or basis, and Twam means like nest, shelter nest, or being the shelter. So, how I translate, I thought about this a lot, and I think what it means, literally, at least one of the things it must mean, is when truth is established, action and its fruit have a valid basis. Action and its fruit have a valid basis. In other words, there is an ashraya. There is a valid basis, a shelter, a refuge, a real foundation for action and the fruit of action. It's a somewhat esoteric verse that I think that bears away some thinking, some meditation. That it reminds me of a verse in the 3rd chapter of the Gita where Krishna says that in the 3rd chapter 3 of the Gita, how does it go? Yagyarta karmanon yatra loko yam karma bandhana. That apart from action, which is the word karma here, which just means action. Apart from action, which is dedicated to sacrifice, or dedicated to God, because the word yajna, sacrifice, another name for Vishnu or God. So, apart from, or except for action, which is a devotional act, an act dedicated to God, every other action in this world causes bondage. Karma bandhana, the karma bondage. So the only loophole, in other words, everything I do causes a reaction. The bad news is, I have to come back to pick up all my reaction. So even if I do good in this world, I give charity, I help people, I'm whatever, non-violent, peaceful, vegetarian, I make all these good choices, I'm virtuous, so I get all these rewards, but you've got to come back to get the rewards. It's almost like, imagine a person's in prison, and this person's a model prisoner. A model prisoner. They do everything right. But the law in that country is if you're a model prisoner, you get all kinds of benefits, but you have to stay in prison to get the benefits. So if you have 3 years of benefits coming, you've got to stay an extra 3 years in prison to get, the cell with a Jew and, library privileges, but you have to stay in prison to get your benefits. That's how good karma is conceived of in this whole culture. That's why you have all these statements like one has to go beyond good and evil. I mean, a typical statement you'll find in the Gita and other literature, because the idea is our real home is in the spiritual realm. And so everything we do in this world, materially, whether it's virtuous or nasty, it has a reaction. It may be a reward or punishment. But reward or punishment, you got to come back and collect them, which means you have to take birth again. So the secret is to act spiritually. Then there's no material reward or punishment. There's only a spiritual reward, and off you go into the wild blue spiritual yonder. And then you're liberated. You're free of karma. So when you are established in truth, then there's really a reason to act. Action has a real valid basis. And the fruit of action and working for some result, there's a good reason to do that. There's a real basis for it. So then, let's see, finishing up, asteya, not stealing. When not stealing is established, then sarva ratna upasthana. All riches are near at hand, and all riches come to you. And one ancient commentator said, this doesn't mean that if you don't steal, that all these jewels will come flying through the air. The word ratna can literally mean a jewel. It often does mean a jewel. But it also comes to mean like a treasure, a valuable thing, or all good things. Sarva ratna, there's all valuable things will be at hand if you don't steal. And what's interesting here about this, I'll read one more, and then you'll start to see a pattern. You'll start to see the logical pattern behind what Patanjali is saying. He says, brahmacharya pratishtayam, when celibacy or chastity, whatever, is established, virya lava, you gain potency. And the word virya, which means like, the word vira is a hero, and like heroic strength, courage. So virya can mean potency in the sense of a heroic or courageous potency. It can also mean potency in the sense of, it's usually not used in that sense, but like our English word virility is related to that. And so here's the pattern, actually, is that you give something up, which is not good, and it comes back to you in a better form. So you give up, let's say, sexual promiscuity or non-spiritual sexual indulgence, because there is such a thing as spiritual sex, but it's not what some hippies thought it was. If you give up sexual promiscuity and so on, what happens is you gain potency. You gain power, you gain potency. And so, similarly, if you give up lying, well, that one doesn't sort of follow the pattern, but if you give up stealing, you don't steal things, all the stuff comes to you anyway. Everything comes to you. All truly valuable things will come to you. So he's trying to say here that virtue has its rewards. Virtue has its rewards. If you give up hostility toward others, other people will give up their hostility. Because in a sense, why do we become hostile? Because we fear someone, we think they're a threat, we want to defend ourselves, we want to make a preemptive strike. What's that guy's name? Wolfowitz? Anyway, a preemptive strike. And so what Patanjali is saying here is that if you give up hostility, people will give up hostility. And so if you give up this greed to steal things, all treasures will come to you. If you give up this desire to be like sexually potent, all potency will come to you. And then finally he says, aparigraha stairye. Stairye, the steadiness of non-possessiveness. Aparigraha stairye. Janma katanta. Very interesting word. The word katan in Sanskrit is just the question, how? That's the interrogative word, how. So katanta literally means howness. And I put the how, trying to translate it. With steadiness and non-possessiveness comes awareness of the how of birth.
What does that mean?
Good question. Okay. Cliffhanger.
To be continued.
Yeah, I was thinking about this, knowing that I would have to face the nation here, and it has some obvious meaning, like how do you take birth at all? Why do we take birth? How is it that a person takes birth in this world? So it's the steadiness in non-possessiveness. So what's the connection here? When we sort of think, we can think together here for a moment, be interactive. What's the connection between not being possessive, admitting that I don't own anything, really, and figuring out what birth is all about. And one thing that occurs to me, if I can call on myself, is that the reason souls, eternal souls, take birth in a non-eternal atmosphere, eternal souls take birth in a non-eternal world, souls who really know everything, understand everything, take birth in a world which in the Upanishads is called avidya, ignorance. So the word ignorance in the Vedas is a standard, it's a very common term for the material world. Ignorance, the ignorance is the material world. And souls who are by nature blissful go through all this suffering. And so it really is because of parigraha. It's because we want to possess things and exploit things. And because our natural position as souls is to be possessed by God in a loving relationship. And so when we want to become the possessors of something that belongs, because there's a sense in which all possessiveness is stealing. Because the oldest Upanishad, the Isa Upanishad, begins by saying everything belongs to God. Isavasi vidam saram. So if I say anything is mine, and I really mean it at the deepest level, and obviously for ordinary transactions, oh, is that your car? No, that's my car. I mean, you got to live in the world. You can't just be like a nut. Say, no, nothing is. And there's even a word for that exactly, vyavaharika. Vyavaharika in Sanskrit means sort of ordinary social intercourse, where you got to say, okay, this is mine, that's yours. And they recognize that. But then there's paramarthika, the highest sense, in which you have to really get it right. So in the paramarthika sense, nothing is ours because it all belongs to the Creator. And so to claim anything is mine is really to be stealing from God, which is the cause of our birth. This desire that rather than serving God, to exploit God. Rather than serving, I want to possess things which actually belong to God, to exploit the creation. That's the cause of birth. That's why we take birth. So that's something that just occurred to me. That's the how, literally katanta, which means like the howness, why it happens of birth. And so you begin to understand how you took birth and why you took birth. And you understand it when you give up the cause of it, when you give up possessiveness and acknowledge that nothing belongs to me. Then you can begin to understand what the problem is.
And you're born with nothing.
Yeah, and leave with nothing. Yes?
I was thinking about the Tibetans, Buddhism that I've been studying. They talk about the idea that you make a bodhisattva vow, that you will help all sentient beings. So you make a vow that you're going to come back because you're here to be a helper. Is that also applicable here?
In the Gita, Krishna mentions sarva bhuta hite, dedicated to the welfare of all beings. So definitely is that concept. Sarva bhuta hite. As far as making a vow, it's a noble vow, and there are great saints in these traditions who have said that, I'm willing to come back again and again to help. So I don't think it was ever formalized into a vow. I think it was always left to the individual, that people would just. But there are souls, certainly in this tradition, who have been dedicated to continuing that work.
So is that concept of reincarnation involved here?
Oh yes, very much. Okay. Yeah, it comes from all those actions. So I guess we finished today's thing. Unless there are any other questions on this? We're moving right along. And then next time we'll do the niyamas. Well, thank you all very much for coming.
Thank you.
Pleasure.